Hi there, this is Adam Jones from Shimano. Hope you guys are well. I am surrounded by some amazing baitcasters on this boat that I'm on in Sweden today. I've been out doing some perch and pike fishing, having a brilliant day, utilising the Metanium DC and various Aldebarans within the Shimano range. I just thought I'd take 5 seconds to just talk about some of the technology in these baitcasters that carries through to lots of baitcasters within the Shimano range, but also a couple of my tips for, I guess, dialing your baitcaster up to try and get a little bit more out of it. So assuming that you've started using a baitcaster, you've got to the stage where you're able to cast it, you're not having too many backlashes, but you're quite conservative in your settings. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my thought process of how I start to step up the speed of the spool of my baitcasters across various bait ranges. So whether I'm fishing big crankbaits or tiny little BFS weighted lures, that thought process carries through the entire range for me. So here we've got a Metanium DC. So this is a DC digital control reel. So the braking system within a DC is controlled electronically. And then I've got a couple of Aldebaran BFSs here. Now this is one of my favorite Shimano reels, and this has the FTB braking system, which is a magnetic braking system. And the way that works is the magnets put resistance onto the spool dependent on how close they are to the spool. It's a really fine mechanism, and that resistance slows the spool down at the end of the cast, therefore applying more brakes. You might find as well that you have a reel with centrifugal brakes, maybe one of the reels before the DC range. Again, those are designed to slow the spool down or not within the cast. So first thing is, like I said, you've got to the stage where you've got a baitcaster, you're casting it, but you haven't necessarily thought about all of the various settings and the things that you might need to manipulate to, for example, extend your cast slightly further, or get to the stage where if you're casting up to cover, so I do a lot of use of a baitcaster within urban environments, so I'll be casting up to a wall of a bridge stanchion, for example, or up to the side of a boat. I want my bait to land and then drop straight down as if I was using a fixed spool rod. The beauty of using a baitcaster over fixed spool in this scenario is when you're letting the bait drop down on a fixed spool, you've obviously got no tension between the spool of your reel and your bait. So there's a moment of slack line as it drifts down to the bottom, whereas with a baitcaster, it's going to run off of the spool. So you see those bites on the way down a lot easier using a baitcaster once you get to the stage that your spool is running fast enough that you can take advantage of that. Now, if it's not running fast enough, what will happen is this is the wall, your bait lands here, and obviously you're under tension, so your bait is going to swing away from the wall. So you're actually starting fishing somewhere over here, whereas you want to get it down as quickly as you can against the structure that you want to fish against. And to do that, you need to be able to dial up the speed on the spool of your baitcaster. So hopefully that makes some sort of sense. And now I'm going to talk you through exactly how you do that. So settings on baitcasters are relatively uniform across baitcasters. So like I said, if I use these two reels as a fine example, we've got a BFS reel here with a magnetic braking system, and we've got a DC reel here with a digital control braking system. But on both of these reels, we have a few very similar pieces within the reel. So obviously you've got a handle. Inside the handle on every reel you'll have your drag star, and then somewhere inside that drag star, it varies from reel to reel, you are going to have a spool tension knob. On the other side of the reel, every reel, you're going to have an ability to dial up or down your brakes. So on an FTB reel, you don't have to do anything internal on the reel. You just turn that up, starts at 0 and goes up to 6, I believe. So you can turn that up and down based on how strong you want those brakes to be. You don't have to open up the reel, you can just do that from the side. On a DC reel, again, you don't have to open anything up on the inside, and it's a slightly different thought process. So you've got, I think, 4 braking options, and then you just need to tell the reel what sort of line it's working with, and the really, really clever internal electronic system figures out the rest. I've got no idea how it does that, but it does do that. That's when you can hear that reel going zzz as it goes away. That is the DC mechanism. So you pick your braking based on the weight of your lure, you tell it what line you've got, you match up your spool tension, and away you go. So that's the differences between the reels. If you had a centrifugal system, you would have to open up the inside of your reel. You've usually got 4 flip out options, which basically like being on a merry-go-round. The further out that you go on the merry-go-round, the more resistance the spool has, and so therefore the more brakes that are being applied. If you fold in all of those brakes, your spool is able to run faster. Easy for me to say. Hopefully you're still with me, and now I can talk to you a little bit about getting your reel to run faster. So let's look at the magnetic system on the Aldebaran. So you've got to the stage where you're able to cast. So the way that you set up a baitcaster to cast is by adjusting the spool tension, and I'm sure you've seen many videos about this. You want your bait to drop off the top of your rod, come down to the water, hit the water without the spool blowing up. So that'll start off quite slow, and then you want that to go slightly faster than that. So you have to stop the spool when it hits the water. That's usually a really good starting point for a baitcaster, and you probably want to have middle to just over middle brakes set on your reel. So at that point, you should be able to cast with a little bit of jeopardy, and jeopardy in baitcasters is key because that's where you're going to get your distance. But you've got enough brakes to control on the way out, and you've got enough spool tension so that you don't blow up as soon as you let go of that spool. Now, when you cast, if the spool blows up as soon as it leaves your hand, your spool tension is too fast. And if it blows up at the end of your cast, you don't have enough brakes. If you use that general rule of thumb, you can tweak your reel to maximize the speed of the spool and maximize the use of the brakes without over braking the lure on the way through. And that is how you will slowly stretch and stretch and stretch your ability to use the baitcaster. Now, again, why is that important? The first thing about getting your spool to run as fast as you possibly can is A, distance, and B, exactly as I said, as soon as it hits the water, you can release your finger off the spool and the line will continue to run out almost on like a free spool option. So you can see the line running and the bait will drop straight down. Obviously, if a fish hits that, firstly, it'll either stop or it'll start to run away. So you've got that ability to feel your bait down but get it to go in a straight line whilst also casting as far as you can. So if it blows up at the beginning, spool tension. If it blows up at the end, brakes. If you remember that with your baitcasters, there really is nowhere that you can't cast. If you've got a bit of wind, you're going to have to adjust for that wind. And again, what you'll find is that suddenly out of nowhere, it's blowing up at the beginning or it's blowing up at the end. Spool tension and brakes. So those rules ring true, whether it's centrifugal, DC, or a magnetic braking system. For me, that's the most important thing with a baitcaster is distance and speed of spool. Hopefully that's given you a few things to think about, and somewhere within this rambling you've learned something, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. Thanks very much for watching, and if you can, like and subscribe. There'll be plenty more videos coming, and hopefully this will help you put a few more fish on the bank. Cheers guys.